The sun burned low in the western sky, casting long streaks of orange fire across the dusty streets of the Arizona settlement. The air was dry, bitter with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and horses, and every wooden porch creaked under the weight of men who had gathered to see the evening's trade. It wasn't cattle they were buying tonight, nor wagons or weapons. It was people. Apache captives, taken in raids that blurred the line between war and slaughter, now bound in rope and humiliation, marched up one by one to stand on the auction block as if they were no more than animals. The voices of the crowd were harsh and hungry, and the laughter that followed each sale scraped against the ears of those who had the misfortune of being on the platform. Caleb Whitlock stood apart from them, leaning in the shadows just outside the saloon, his hat brim pulled low against the sinking sun. His boots were worn thin, scuffed from years of hard marching, and his pockets carried little more than dust. Once, he had been a soldier in the Union Army, carrying a rifle and the heavy burden of belief that a man could fight for honor and justice. That had been nearly a decade ago, but the echoes of war still haunted him, trailing him through every settlement like a ghost that refused to loosen its grip. Since then, he had drifted from town to town, working for a few dollars here and there, drinking through most of them, and running from memories that wouldn't stay buried. His last coin lay folded in his palm, a single crumpled dollar that felt more like a weight than wealth. He told himself he hadn't come to watch, but curiosity or maybe shame had drawn him here, as though seeing the cruel pageant might remind him of how far he had fallen. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with a voice sharp enough to cut glass, barked prices with the speed of a gambler throwing dice. A boy no older than 12 was sold to a rancher who boasted about breaking him into 10 cattle. A woman, thin and gaunt, fetched less than a mule. The crowd jeered, and Caleb felt his stomach turn, though he kept his face still. And then she appeared. The men felt quieter, not silent but less sure of their laughter. She walked under the push of 2 guards, her wrists bound before her with frayed rope, her ankles dragging in the dust. Yet despite the way they handled her, despite the smears of dirt across her skin and the tangled river of black hair falling around her face, she walked with a straightness that no rope could erase. Her eyes, dark, fierce, unbroken, met the crowd as though daring them to look away first. She was young, no more than 17, but there was a fire in her expression that made her seem older, made her seem untouchable even as she stood on that block. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly eager to be rid of her. "Here's a wild one, gentlemen. Apache stock, strong, healthy, stubborn as hell. You'll need a firm hand if you want to keep her, but she'll work, she'll fetch, she'll serve." His words dissolved into the low chuckles of the crowd. Caleb felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity, he'd seen too much for that, but recognition. She stood proud, even bound, the way he once had when he wore his uniform. She had not surrendered, not in her body, not in her gaze. In her, he saw everything he had lost. The bidding began. $2, shouted a man in a bowler hat. 3, barked another, his beard dripping with tobacco juice. 4. The numbers rose slowly, not with real hunger but with the half-hearted interest of men who wanted to prove that they could afford to claim her. She would not fetch much, everyone knew what trouble came with Apache captives. Most tried to run, and many succeeded, leaving their buyers bitter and out of pocket. Caleb's hand tightened around the crumpled dollar. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just lifted it slightly, his voice rough and cracked. $1. The auctioneer blinked, the crowd erupting in laughter. $1. The man sneered, spitting into the dust. "We're not selling scraps, soldier boy." But as the laughter died, no one else raised their price. The men smirked, whispered to each other, and shook their heads. They didn't want her badly enough to risk the trouble. The bidding stalled. The girl stood tall, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. The auctioneer scowled, scratching his greasy neck. "Last chance. Anyone beat $1. Silence. He spat again and waved his hand in disgust. "Fine. Sold. Take her before I regret it." The crowd laughed anew, jeering as Caleb stepped forward with his single dollar, pressing it into the auctioneer's hand. A few men clapped mockingly, shouting, "She'll slit your throat before morning." And, "Best dollar you'll ever waste." Caleb ignored them. He reached for the rope that bound her wrists, the coarse fibers digging into his calloused hands as he led her away from the block. He could feel her eyes on him, sharp as a knife's edge, but she said nothing. They passed the saloon, the livery stable, the general store, all places Caleb had once sought comfort in, now hollow as an old shell. The farther they walked from the crowd, the quieter it grew until only the sound of their boots on dry dirt filled the space between them. At the edge of town, he stopped. The last rays of the sun spread across the horizon, painting the desert in blood and fire. He turned to her, her wrists still bound, and for the first time, he met her gaze fully. "You're free of them," he said, his voice low. "But I can't say you're free of me yet." His knife slid from his belt, sharp and steady, and with one quick motion he cut through the rope. The fibers fell to the ground like dead snakes. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She only rubbed her wrists, staring at him with that same unreadable fire. Caleb sheathed his knife and looked away, his throat dry. He had no plan, no food, no home, no future. All he knew was that he had given his last dollar not to own her, not even to save her, but because something in her gaze had forced him to remember he was still a man capable of choosing right, even if it cost him everything. The town behind them roared back to life with the sounds of music and shouting, but here, at the edge of the desert, the night opened wide and silent. Caleb didn't know where the road would lead, or if either of them would survive it. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he had done something that felt like it mattered. And as the girl stood beside him, her posture proud and unbroken, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was the one who had purchased him. The desert night spread out like an endless ocean, its silence broken only by the whisper of wind through brittle sage and the distant yip of coyotes prowling the ridges. Caleb Whitlock built a small fire beneath a crooked mesquite tree, its branches twisted like the ribs of an old skeleton. Sparks leapt skyward before vanishing into the dark. The Apache girl sat across from him, knees pulled to her chest, her black hair spilling like ink down her back. She had not spoken since he had cut her bonds, though her eyes never left him. He felt their weight more than the desert chill, sharp and unyielding, as though she could peel back the layers of his soul simply by looking. He tried to offer her a strip of jerky from the pouch at his belt, but she shook her head. "A caged bird does not eat from her keeper's hand," she said finally, her voice low and fierce, the first words she had given him. They struck like flint, sparking something inside him. He had not thought of himself as her keeper, not even for a moment, yet hearing it aloud forced him to confront the truth. By pulling her from one chain, he had risked binding her with another. He laid the jerky back down by the fire, ashamed. The night deepened. Caleb leaned back against the tree, his body aching with the fatigue of years, not just the day's walk. He studied the girl's face in the shifting glow of the firelight. She was proud, but she was also young. Younger than he had thought on the block, perhaps not yet grown into womanhood. The weight of her defiance was far heavier than her years should have carried. He wondered about her family, if they were alive, if she had been taken from them screaming, if they still searched the horizon for her return. He had seen the way soldiers burned villages, how easily children became orphans, and he clenched his jaw, remembering. War had no mercy for the innocent. At dawn, they began walking. Caleb expected her to follow his lead, but after only a short distance she moved ahead, striding into the desert with the certainty of one who belonged to it. He tried to keep pace, stumbling over rocks and uneven ground, his boots heavy, his throat dry. She seemed tireless, her feet barely whispering against the sand, her eyes always fixed on the horizon. At first he thought she was running away from him, but she never strayed far, always glancing back with a look that was not gratitude but challenge. As though to say, keep up, if you can. By noon, the sun beat down mercilessly, burning the earth to powder. Caleb's canteen was nearly empty. His shoulders sagged, sweat stung his eyes, and every scar from his soldiering days seemed to throb beneath his skin. Yet she pressed on, unbending, her face calm. Finally, when his legs faltered, she stopped and turned to him. "You were a soldier," she said, her accent shaping the words differently, but her meaning was clear. Caleb blinked at her, surprised. "How would you know?" "The way you walk," she answered. "Always watching the ground, as if it still holds death. Men who hunt or herd, they look ahead. Soldiers look down." Her words pierced him, truer than he wanted to admit. He remembered the fields of Virginia, the thick mud that hid mines and broken bodies, the endless scanning of the earth for traps. Even years later, he had never stopped. She had seen it in a matter of hours. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I was. A long time ago." She studied him for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. Without another word, she veered toward a dry arroyo. She knelt by the cracked bed, dug with her hands until damp sand appeared, and then, with patient skill, coaxed a trickle of water into a shallow hollow. She drank first, then gestured for him to do the same. The water was warm, gritty, but life itself in that searing heat. Caleb drank deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and when he looked at her again, he realized the balance between them had shifted. He was no longer her rescuer. She was his guide. That night, they camped near a cluster of boulders where the desert wind howled like wolves. Caleb tried again to speak, to explain himself, but she silenced him with a glance. "Do not tell me why you bought me," she said. "Your reasons are yours. My freedom is mine." He nodded, stung but silent. He realized that in all the choices he had made, leaving home, taking up arms, wandering without purpose, this was the first time someone had forced him to face himself without excuse. He had given his last dollar not to possess her, but because something inside him had demanded it. Yet he was beginning to see that it was not charity, not sacrifice. It was survival. Not hers, his. On the third day, the desert gave way to higher ground, the rocks jagged, the air thinner, cooler. Pines appeared along the ridges, their scent sharp, a reminder of lands far from war. The girl led them upward, her steps sure along paths that seemed invisible to him. He stumbled more than once, catching himself on rocks, but she never slowed, never offered a hand. She expected him to endure. He did. At the crest of a ridge, she stopped. The horizon stretched wide and endless before them, a sea of mountains layered in blues and grays, the sky vast above. For a long while, she said nothing, simply breathing the air as though reclaiming a part of herself. Caleb stood beside her, his chest heaving, his legs trembling, but for the first time in years, he felt something like peace. Finally, she turned to him. Her eyes were softer now, though no less fierce. "You spent your last dollar to buy me," she said. "But you never owned me. Not for a moment. What you did buy, for yourself, was a chance." He frowned, not understanding. "A chance for what?" "To be free again," she said simply. "You carry chains heavier than rope. You fight ghosts that are not here. You look at the ground because you fear what waits beneath it. But the ground is only earth now. The war is not here. Look." She gestured to the horizon, the endless expanse of sky and stone. "This is freedom, if you have the courage to take it." Her words struck him harder than any bullet ever had. He realized then that he had not freed her, she had freed herself long before, in the fire of her spirit that no chain could crush. It was he who had been bound, shackled to guilt, regret, and the memory of a war that had stripped him of purpose. She had led him here, not to save her life, but to remind him that his own was not yet lost. Caleb stood in silence, the wind rushing cold against his face, and for the first time in years he lifted his gaze from the ground. The mountains stretched infinite, unbroken, eternal. He felt the weight in his chest ease, the chains loosening, the air filling him not with sorrow but with possibility. When he turned back, she was already walking into the trees, her figure blending into the wild as naturally as a hawk vanishing into the sky. She did not look back. She did not need to. And as Caleb watched her disappear into the wilderness, he understood, he had not saved her. She had saved him.